What is an ESFP? These four letters stand for Extroverted Sensing, Feeling, and Perceiving in the Myers-Briggs personality typing system, which was based on the psychologist Carl Jung's theory of the cognitive functions. An ESFP is someone who prefers to use the cognitive functions Extroverted Sensing, Introverted Feeling, Extroverted Thinking, and Introverted Intuition, roughly in that order of frequency, and we'll get into what each function does a bit later. But first, you've probably heard that the ESFP is daring, adventurous, spontaneous, the life of the party, and perhaps even especially attractive. In reality, any type may possess those characteristics, while an actual ESFP might not. Why? Well, because those are personality traits, which are characteristics that can change over time and can be consciously developed. Think of it as the content of personality. The content can change depending on what you put into it, which may include culture, upbringing, personal experiences, and so on. Carl Jung was not focusing on personality traits, but personality types, a classification system that does not change over time. Since it is fixed, it has to offer enough flexibility to account for the variations within, the variation being the diverse content of personality traits. So think of personality type as the structure that is capable of containing a variety of content. Certain structures may tend to lead to certain content, but correlation does not equal causation. So what is this structure? In short, it's your system of information digestion. It's how you tend to perceive, retain, organize, and prioritize information. This is denoted by your cognitive functions. At no point should these cognitive functions be confused with universal, biological, and executive functions like the five senses and planning for the future. Alright, now let's get into it. The ESFP's strongest function is SE, which is oriented outwards and inhabits the concrete domain. SE is a perceiving function, so it has to do with how the ESFP observes and experiences concrete information. In this case, as an extrovert, they're receptive and attuned to the external world, and may spend less time checking in with their internal world. Perhaps surprisingly, this may actually come as a shock to some confirmed ESFPs, because for them, their dominant SE makes them extra sensitive to annoying concrete realities, like the sound of an air conditioner churning in the background, which might not be as disruptive to many other types. Indeed, when the external reality becomes too irritating or monotonous, the ESFP does welcome a much-needed break. Alright, so I know a lot of people associate SE with, or even define it as, the five senses, but I wouldn't be making headlines asserting that, barring some disability, we all use the five senses. So then the popular assertion becomes that high SE users are somehow better at using their five senses, as in they have better reflexes, and so on. Now, whether there's a connection there is hard to say, but this is not the heart of SE. The heart is that SE experiences the world as concrete, immutable externalities. Immutable not because things cannot be changed. You can smash a rock, but it'll still be a smashed rock. This is in contrast to SI, which has a subjective interpretation of the rock, over time creating a subjective image of an ideal or standard rock in the mind's eye. To SE, this particular rock is this particular rock. Being extroverted, it doesn't retain anything, so there's no sense of certain objects being out of place. There's no sense that this rock, or this food, or this movie doesn't fit in with others in its category. Each sensory experience is perceived in the here and now in its own right, without subjective interpretation or interference. As a dominant SE user, such is how the ESFP often experiences the world. I realize that a lot of people don't relate to being ESFP because they somehow interpret SE's immutable perception as being completely satisfied with the present moment, like some sort of Zen master. I'm pretty sure almost nobody relates to Zen masterhood unless they've had a lot of practice, and if they do relate, well, I'm jealous. Not to mention, a satisfaction is in the realm of evaluating or judging, which has nothing to do with our perceiving function SE here. So on the contrary, I find that almost no ESFPs are satisfied as is, and that there's an extra hard push on manifesting, as in bringing objects and experiences into existence, molding reality around them, smashing that rock if you will. So this goes hand in hand with the famous association between SE and force. These depictions usually pigeonhole SE to some sort of warrior berserker type. It could turn out like that, but there are many more subtle manifestations of SE force that I think paints a more complete picture. There is always a sense of them guiding themselves and others towards more and better physical realities. If they want the latest gadget, they'll work hard to buy it. If they wanted a medium rare steak, but it came out well done, they'll probably send it back. And if they want to be surrounded by riches and luxuries, they'll rally themselves and sometimes others to get it done. Speaking of luxuries, the ESFP does have a hedonistic stereotype, and while it may sometimes manifest as such, it's important to look at the driver. Extroverted perception is exploratory, and SE can be seen as this fearless sensory explorer, while SI can be seen as a picky sensory connoisseur. SE is always demanding more and different, making the ESFP generally spontaneous, extremely open to new experiences, and pretty fun company for those who can handle them. The key word should probably be variety rather than luxury. As long as it's a good experience, they're just as comfortable at a hole in the wall as they are at a swanky restaurant. This need for variety and exploration can make them appear ENFP at times, but the emphasis on manifesting sets the ESFPs apart. While NE is content to look at the world in a multitude of ways, SE sees the world as it is right now. They're grounded, stuck if you will, in the present moment, the circumstances of which can only be changed through the physical rearrangement and overcoming of objects. Because of all these factors, they likely have the admirable quality of tackling obstacles head-on rather than shirking from them. Let's also talk about what the ESFP is not. They value variety and abundance in objects, physical experiences, and concrete information, and do not like arbitrary rules that limit them. This means that they tend to not like following seemingly meaningless categories and established wisdom. When a problem presents itself, they'd much rather use their perceptions in the present moment and give it their all to conquer these obstacles, even if it takes a few blind tries to get it right, instead of reflecting on what has worked in the past for themselves and others to find a tried and true method. They don't even want to have a method, but would much rather be open and free to explore various concrete possibilities. Now I should probably do a little introduction here, since possibilities is a word that's eternally associated with NE. There might be a bit of overlap, but here are all the possible ways we can tackle this problem. That's SE, and what if we lived in an alternate universe? What if this problem didn't even exist in the first place? That's NE. Okay, so SE has this grounded and practical exploration of possibilities, making the ESFP quite dynamic and agile as they hop from obstacle to opportunity. Though it isn't externally obvious, being a sensor, the ESFP can be adept at following established, detailed procedures, but their preference for going fast and trying new things places that ability on the back burner. As a result, they often seem impulsive, diving into endeavors without thorough research. Compounding all of this is the ESFP's other extroverted function, TE. TE is a judging function, governing how the ESFP structures information. TE structures the external world based on what makes sense in the moment, based on what works, and it does so via external information and empirical logic. TE isn't very strong in the ESFP, so they're not always the best at implementing effective actions and procedures. However, combined with the force and energy of SE, TE external logical structuring can have a whirlwind effect. Contrary to the party animal and/or hippie stereotype, ESFPs are often incredibly industrious and the epitome of the work hard, play hard creed. They often do quite well for themselves, restlessly attacking an obstacle until it falls. This is because whatever their TE shortcomings are, they're often made up by the strength of their SE. If something doesn't work, they'll put more SE pressure on it, that is, rallying more objects and more people until reality bends their way. The downside to this is that they often do things simply because there's a clear, concrete opportunity. But things aren't always what they seem, and if they are, the market is probably already oversaturated. In this sense, the ESFP's TE abilities are often led by SE towards the flashy and evident opportunities in front of them. Together, through SE and TE, the ESFP interacts with and imposes upon the external world. They create the empowering sense of conquering reality, grappling with concrete objects and circumstances and mastering them. SE and TE amplify each other nicely as the ESFP juts from one thing to another, while TE forms its empirical evaluations based on direct, unadulterated, concrete observations. However, since their logical judgment is weak in the first place and all of it is oriented outward, the ESFP can have a difficult time with internal logical consistency. And this problem is actually compounded by strong FI. FI is the ESFP's first and most active point of contact with their inner world. FI is a judging function, structuring and prioritizing information based on personal feelings, including desires and preferences. This doesn't mean that the ESFP is always doing whatever they feel like doing at any given time. There's some degree of complexity in this internal emotional model, such that there can be a feeling of not wanting to take out the garbage, but also a feeling of relief for taking out the garbage so you don't have to do it later. Different feelings, desires, and preferences coalesce into the first inklings of consistency in the ESFP that can rein in their SE and TE activity to an extent. However, as is always the case with FI, it stays consistent with its own feelings and preferences and makes no appeal to any sort of logical consistency. TE might exhibit in one way in one SE situation, but appear completely different in another situation. Thus, while the ESFP's actions make sense to themselves, falling within the general vicinity of things that they like and don't find morally objectionable, they may appear baffling to outside observers. Unlike the ISFP, who mobilizes their weaker SE and TE towards relatively stable FI desires, the ESFP is opportunistic with their SE and TE activity, jumping onto whatever they can while FI sits back and evaluates how it feels about these activities, only developing some consistency over time. This is the key difference between these two types and should help you distinguish between them even in the case of a more socially shy ESFP or a more socially outgoing ISFP. What makes this easier is that the frenetic pace of the external world can be so gripping that the ESFP may often be too busy to use FI without prompting, even though their FI is rather strong. The strength of the ESFP's FI is obvious whenever they're defending themselves against someone who crossed an FI boundary. They also have endearing moments when they express their feelings unfiltered, often coming across rather passionate and genuine. However, their inner emotional structure is not very comprehensive or anchored unless they tap into NI, which we'll get into later. The ESFP might not consciously pay attention to their FI until they've exhausted themselves looking outward through their SE and TE. When they find themselves making strides but feeling like they aren't really going anywhere, their inner feelings and values should be the first place to look, though many ESFP's first instinct is to cover up the problem with more and more TE activity. The ESFP may sometimes be too impatient to sit down and introspect, but when they do, great insights about themselves are often gained. As the ESFP gets more in touch with their FI, it might be a scary process as they recognize all the ways their inner preferences are at odds with the external world in which they primarily inhabit. This leads many ESFPs to soften their expressions to somewhat socially appropriate or expected levels while still staying true to themselves. In this way, they tend to be more conventionally charismatic and socially adept than their ISFP counterparts. The thing that gives the ESFP their seemingly paradoxical idealism and future ambitions is their inferior function in I. NI is a perceiving function governing how one retains and structures information. NI is vague and overarching, focusing on the big picture rather than specific instances. Being an intuition function, NI focuses on what's not concretely there, so not on the chair and the table and the room, but perhaps why they're there. Maybe we're expecting guests. The unspoken meaning and intentions behind the concrete facade. Being introverted, NI subjectivizes these elements. In order to make sense of all the conceptual information, it forms patterns and trajectories. Sometimes NI plays with themes, thanks to its visual nature, but I think most notably, NI maps out cause and effect relationships, linearly tying together time. Although NI is the ESFP's weakest function, it should not be underestimated because the weakness of the inferior function usually creates an insecurity, a preoccupation. Repression leads to fixation. Many ESFPs have a love-or-hate relationship with NI. On one hand, they detest the idea of ultimate meaning and consequence because they're afraid that any preoccupation about such things would limit the freedom of their SE exploration. On the other hand, when life isn't working out so well, they crave the ability to use NI like an expert. Generally, when things don't go right, their lack of NI is the first thing they blame. Many ESFPs have experienced rude awakenings after investing tons of time and energy into an endeavor, only to be confronted with unintended consequences. If only they could pay more attention to the bigger vision instead of tempting present opportunities, but then they wouldn't be ESFP. This is not to say that ESFPs can't grasp the intuitive bigger picture. On the contrary, many are quite good at it, developing affinities for grand explanations and ultimate meanings like religion and mysticism. However, outside of isolated interests, in the living of day-to-day life, the ESFP will almost always pick the sensorially exciting over what's meaningful in the long term. Insecurity often leads to overcompensation. Because of the mishmash of sensory extravaganza and the lack of logical consistency in their lives, they're prone to going on quests in search of meaning. They could suddenly develop a grand ambition of making the world a better place. Such vague and hopeful idealism make it really easy for the ESFP to identify as an NF type. The search for meaning can also result in more negative manifestations like falling prey to cultish groups and pseudoscientific practices that lure people in with a false promise of ultimate meaning or purpose. Furthermore, because they see so few intuitive patterns and trajectories, they tend to take them far too seriously. For example, seeing 2 instances of people being mean to them in the same day and thinking that there must be a conspiracy. Another way the ESFP can misuse NI is by wrongfully projecting the present indefinitely into the future. For example, feeling disheartened after a failure, then quickly projecting that the future will be filled with similar failures, for no particular reason other than that the present is bad and it also feels bad. Because of all of this conscious intuitive preoccupation, the ESFP may actually talk about meaning and mysticism quite a bit, and combined with their propensity for sensory novelty, they may even come across as a high NE user. But be not fooled, the novel concepts the ESFP stumbles upon are only the side effects of their main drive towards sensory variety and opportunity. Hey everyone! So now I'm going to give some of my personal opinions about the ESFP. So I'm actually recording this video before I even write the ESFP video that you just saw. So I thought that'd be better because it'll be my actual thoughts like right off the bat. So ESFP is my supervisor type in Socionics relationships. I guess if you want to learn more about Socionics relationships, I'll link a type square below this video. Yeah, so supposedly in this relationship, I'm supposed to feel kind of like insecure and I should try to impress the ESFP, which I think is actually kind of accurate. Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing. Like, I don't want to know that I'm trying to impress anyone, but yeah, I think that is the case. And when I was a lot younger, like when I was in college, when I first started learning about the MBTI and I only knew about the dichotomy, so not the cognitive functions, only like, are you a thinker or a feeler? So during that time, I actually really wanted to be ESFP, and I would keep saying that I'm ESFP. Yeah, like deep down I knew I wasn't, but I kept trying to convince myself that I was because I'm really envious of that type because they're so carefree, or they have like the potential capability of being so carefree and spontaneous, and I also see them as brave. Like they can express their individuality in such a brave way, and like not, I mean, I do think they modulate themselves with TE quite a bit, but on the outside, it doesn't appear like their individuality really suffers. So I feel like they can just bravely do the things that they want and just enjoy life. Okay, so the ESFPs I know also are very charming. So I think I only know, is it just one? No, the three. Okay, I definitely know more than one ESFP. I think it's something like 3. And so despite the stereotypes, one of them is actually quite successful. And the other one, I think, is probably on his way to becoming successful because they're very charismatic, but in a different way than the way that FJs are charismatic. So like, it seems like they are charismatic just being themselves. So it's not like this active form of charisma, whereas like if I wanted someone to work for me and convince other people to do things, I would probably think like an FJ would maybe be the best person at doing that. But if I just want to hire a person to be liked, just sit there and be liked, it would definitely be ESFP and the ENFP. Yeah, they're just, but I think the people that I know, I think the ESFP is more like actively charismatic than the ENFP. Like I think the ESFP with their SE, they really want things. They want to do things, they want to be things, and yeah, they're not content to just sit around and think about it. So they really like want these things. So they'll go out and get it. And yeah, that SE with the TE, sometimes it's like so forceful and so magnetic. They can be more, I don't know, more out there than the ENTJ. They can be more successful than the ENTJ for sure. You know, not always, but they can be. Yeah, and despite all of that, they somehow are relaxed. Like it seems like they just have infinite energy. Like they can do things, do, but then it doesn't seem to tire them. You know what I mean? Like they look effortless. They don't look like they're making so much effort. Like things are hard for them. Yeah, so I don't know if I just have all these good things to say about the ESFP because they're my supervisor, or if everyone agrees with me. You can let me know in the comments. Okay, I feel like I should say something bad about the ESFP. Sometimes they can really want something but have no direction to go in. Like for example, I know an ESFP who really wanted to be rich, so that was his end goal, and his way to do it was like start a company, but then he had no idea like what type of company. Like so it was just day 1 would be like, let's start a flower shop, and then day 2 would be like, let's start a bar. Like so it would keep changing, and then the third day it's like, let's do a tech company, so they have their goal, like their NI goal, but there's kind of no path, and their SE would just like hop all over the place. The other thing that I will say is that they seem a bit forgetful and directionless. Like they could have, yeah, I guess it's maybe a pet peeve. Like if I say an idea and then to the ESFP and then later they're like, oh, that was my idea. Or they tell the same idea back to me like it's a new thing. It's like, I just said that. But I guess that could be true with ENFPs as well. It's just like inferior introverted perception, so inferior SI or NI, it tends to not really retain these things. So you might have to tell the ESFP like multiple times of one thing. Yeah, overall, I like the ESFP despite the whole supervisor thing. It can be a bit intimidating. Like if they tell me last minute to go skiing or go-karting, I'm not gonna go. So they are so spontaneous. I'll just like go right then. But just sitting around talking and hanging out with the ESFP is cool, but I can't be that spontaneous. Yeah. All right. So I think that's all I have to say off the top of my head about the ESFP. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you would like me to type you, then I do have that service on my website, kind of8.com. Thank you for watching.